By the opening decades of the 20th century, naval supremacy rested decisively upon the battleship. These steel leviathans, armed with arrays of heavy guns and protected by thick armor plate, represented the ultimate expression of surface combat power.
Yet for all their firepower, battleships operated under a fundamental constraint. Their effective reach extended no further than the optical horizon, roughly 20 to 40 kilometers under optimal conditions.
Detection of enemy formations, coordination of fleet movements, and delivery of offensive strikes all depended upon direct visual contact, or the limited range of naval gunfire. The emergence of powered, heavier-than-air flight between 1903 and 1910 presented naval strategists with an unprecedented opportunity.
Aircraft offered the potential to extend reconnaissance range by hundreds of kilometers, locate adversary fleets well beyond visual distance, and deliver ordnance against targets unreachable by conventional naval artillery.
Between 1908 and 1945, this technological innovation fostered the development of a revolutionary warship class, the aircraft carrier. What began as experimental platforms, temporary wooden decks bolted onto cruiser hulls, evolved within 3 decades into purpose-built floating air bases capable of projecting striking power across distances that rendered traditional gun-based engagements obsolete. By the conclusion of World War II in the Pacific, the aircraft carrier had displaced the battleship as the capital ship of modern naval warfare, fundamentally reordering maritime strategy and establishing a doctrinal framework that persists into the present day. This transformation was neither inevitable nor universally recognized. Naval establishments in the United States, Britain, and Japan pursued divergent approaches to carrier development, shaped by strategic geography, industrial capacity, and doctrinal conservatism. The path from Eugene Ely's precarious takeoff from USS Birmingham in November 1910 to the decisive carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 involved continuous experimentation, bureaucratic resistance, international treaty constraints, and hard-won operational lessons. Understanding this evolution requires examining not only the technical progression of carrier design, but also the shifting strategic concepts that governed their employment and ultimately validated their supremacy over the gun-armed warships that had dominated naval thought for half a century. Naval aviation did not emerge in isolation. Throughout the 19th century, major fleets had experimented with lighter-than-air observation platforms, tethered balloons, and kites for reconnaissance and fire direction. These systems provided elevated vantage points that extended visual range beyond the limitations of mast-mounted lookouts, but remained constrained by weather conditions, vulnerable to enemy fire, and incapable of independent maneuver. By the turn of the 20th century, naval officers possessed operational experience coordinating aerial observation with surface operations, establishing institutional familiarity with the concept of airborne assets supporting fleet movements. The successful flights of the Wright brothers in 1903 and subsequent European developments in powered aviation between 1906 and 1908 immediately attracted military attention. In 1908, a U.S. Army Signal Corps
naval attaché stationed in France submitted a detailed report to the Navy Department arguing that aircraft could replace balloons and kites for fleet reconnaissance. The officer proposed two integration methods: catapult systems mounted directly on warships, or temporary launching platforms constructed on auxiliary vessels.
Both approaches reflected practical recognition that conventional aircraft required forward velocity for flight, unlike balloons, which could operate while stationary. Theoretical conceptualization advanced rapidly. In 1909, French aviation pioneer Clement Ader published L'Aviation Militaire, a treatise that anticipated the specialized aircraft carrier with remarkable precision.
AD described a vessel featuring a continuous flight deck extending the full length of the hull, hangar facilities below the flight deck for aircraft storage and maintenance, elevators connecting hangar and flight decks, and dedicated systems for launching and recovering aircraft.
This vision essentially defined the carrier's architectural template decades before such vessels entered service, paralleling how Italian engineer Vittorio Cuniberti and British Admiral John Fisher had independently conceptualized the all-big gun battleship, the Dreadnought, several years earlier. Practical experimentation began in the United States.
On November 14, 1910, civilian aviator Eugene Ely flew a Curtiss Model D biplane off a temporary 25-meter wooden platform constructed over the bow of the cruiser USS Birmingham while anchored in Hampton Roads, Virginia.
The aircraft dropped below the deck level immediately after launch, the landing gear briefly contacting the water's surface, but Ely maintained control and flew approximately 4 kilometers to Willoughby Spit Airfield.
2 months later, on January 18, 1911, Ely executed the first shipboard landing, touching down on a 36-meter platform aboard the armored cruiser USS Pennsylvania in San Francisco Bay.
This platform incorporated an arresting system consisting of 22 transverse ropes weighted with 50-pound sandbags. Hooks attached beneath Ely's aircraft engaged these ropes, bringing the plane to a halt within 30 feet. After lunch with the ship's officers, Ely took off from the same platform and returned to shore. These demonstrations convinced naval leadership that aircraft integration was feasible. By early 1914, the Navy operated 6 seaplanes, float plane variants that could take off from and land on water, eliminating the need for shipboard platforms, but accepting performance penalties from the weight and drag of pontoons. European powers pursued similar programs. France, Britain, and Russia converted merchant vessels and older warships into seaplane tenders, ships equipped with cranes capable of hoisting seaplanes from the water for maintenance and lowering them for operations. HMS Hermes, commissioned in 1913 as a dedicated seaplane carrier, could transport and support 10 aircraft, representing the Royal Navy's first purpose-designed aviation vessel, though still based on the seaplane tender concept rather than incorporating flight decks. By the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, the foundational elements of naval aviation existed. demonstrated capability to launch and recover aircraft from ships, operational experience with seaborne air assets, and conceptual frameworks for specialized carrier vessels. What remained uncertain was whether these capabilities would prove strategically relevant in fleet combat, or whether aircraft would remain marginal platforms, limited to reconnaissance roles, while battleships continued to dominate naval warfare through gunpower. World War I served as the forcing ground for carrier development, accelerating experimentation and revealing the operational limitations of early approaches. The conflict's outbreak in August 1914 immediately demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional reconnaissance methods for locating enemy fleets across the vast expanses of the North Sea and Atlantic.
Seaplanes offered extended observation range, but their dependence on calm water for takeoff and landing severely restricted operational availability, particularly in the rough seas characteristic of northern European waters. Britain led initial conversions.
The Royal Navy transformed several vessels into seaplane carriers, including HMS Hermes, commissioned 1913, and HMS Ark Royal, 1914, each equipped with cranes capable of hoisting 10 to 12 float planes from the water for maintenance and lowering them for operations.
However, seaplanes consistently underperformed land-based aircraft due to the weight and aerodynamic drag of pontoon floats, which reduced speed, climb rate, and payload capacity. More critically, operations ceased entirely when sea conditions exceeded safe recovery thresholds, a frequent occurrence in North Atlantic patrol zones.
The delivery technical breakthrough came with HMS Furious, a vessel whose iterative modifications between 1917 and 1918 established the fundamental carrier architecture. Originally designed as a light battlecruiser mounting two 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever deployed, Furious was modified during construction. In June 1917, the forward turret was removed and replaced with a 14-meter flight deck constructed over a hangar housing 10 aircraft. This configuration permitted aircraft launches, but created severe turbulence problems for landing due to airflow disruption from the central superstructure and the remaining aft turret. On August 2, 1917, Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning executed the first landing on a moving warship, touching down a Sopwith-Pup fighter on Furious's forward deck while the vessel steamed into the wind at 26 knots.
The delivery speed provided sufficient airflow over the deck to enable a near-zero ground speed landing. 5 days later, attempting a second landing, Dunning's aircraft was caught by turbulence from the superstructure, stalled, and crashed off the starboard side, killing him.
This tragedy demonstrated that split-deck configurations with central obstructions were inherently dangerous. In November 1917, Furious returned to dockyard for reconstruction. The aft 18-inch turret was removed and replaced with a 91-meter landing deck and second hangar, creating a 176-meter combined flight deck split by the midships superstructure.
Aircraft now launched from the forward deck and landed on the aft deck, theoretically separating operations. In practice,
pilots still encountered severe turbulence when approaching the landing area, and moving aircraft between the two deck sections required navigating narrow walkways around the superstructure in wind and weather, a hazardous procedure.
Despite limitations, this configuration enabled the first carrier strike mission in naval history. On July 19, 1918, Furious launched 7 Sopwith-Camel fighters armed with 50-pound bombs to attack the German naval airship base at Tondern in Schleswig-Holstein. The raid destroyed Zeppelin's L-54 and L-60 and their hangar facilities, demonstrating that carriers could project offensive power against shore installations beyond the range of surface gunfire. British losses totaled 2 aircraft, 1 shot down, 1 ditched at sea, but both pilots were recovered. Parallel development produced HMS Argus, completed in September 1818 as the world's first true flush-deck carrier. Converted from the incomplete Italian liner Conte Rosso, Argus featured a completely unobstructed 172-meter flight deck with no island superstructure. The delivery exhausts were ducted horizontally aft through the stern, eliminating vertical smokestacks that would have disrupted airflow. Displacing 15,775 tons with accommodations for 15 to 18 aircraft, Argus established the template for all subsequent carrier designs. Continuous flight deck, below-deck hangars, aircraft elevators connecting hangar and flight deck, and arresting gear for recovery operations. The vessel entered service too late for combat operations. The armistice was signed November 11, 1918, less than 2 months after commissioning, but validated the flush deck concept through extensive post-war trials.
By war's end, the essential technical problems of carrier aviation had been identified, if not fully solved. Successful operations required unobstructed flight decks to minimize turbulence, arresting systems to halt landing aircraft in limited deck space, hangar facilities for aircraft protection and maintenance, elevators for rapid aircraft deployment, and sufficient displacement to accommodate these systems while maintaining seakeeping and speed.
The seaplane carrier approach, deploying float planes via cranes, was conclusively proven inferior to the wheeled aircraft carrier concept. What remained uncertain was whether carriers would evolve beyond auxiliary reconnaissance platforms to become primary striking units capable of engaging enemy fleets. A question that would be answered during the interwar period as major navies translated wartime lessons into purpose-built designs.
The post-war naval environment was shaped decisively by the Washington Naval Treaty, signed February 6, 1922, which established tonnage limits for capital ships among the major naval powers.
The treaty capped battleship displacement and total battleship tonnage per nation, but imposed comparatively lenient restrictions on aircraft carriers. 135,000 tons total for the United States and Britain, 81,000 tons for Japan, and 60,000 tons each for France and Italy.
Individual carriers were limited to 27,000 tons, with each nation permitted 2 exceptions at 33,000 tons. These provisions created an immediate conversion opportunity. Incomplete battleships and battle cruisers scheduled for cancellation under treaty limits could instead be completed as large carriers.
The United States exercised its exemptions to convert two Lexington-class battlecruiser hulls into USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. Commissioned in 1927, these vessels displaced 36,000 tons standard with 271-meter flight decks capable of accommodating 78 to 90 aircraft.
Their battlecruiser engineering plants provided 33-knot maximum speed, making them the fastest capital ships in any navy, and ensuring they could outpace contemporary battleships. The large displacement permitted extensive aviation fuel storage, ammunition magazines, and workshops, establishing them as fleet flagships rather than auxiliary units. For over a decade, Lexington and Saratoga remained the world's largest carriers, setting American expectations for carrier capabilities. Japan pursued similar conversions. The battleship Kaga and battlecruiser Akagi, both slated for cancellation, were completed as carriers between 1927 and 1928. Akagi initially featured an unusual three-deck configuration with separate decks for launch and recovery operations, but this arrangement proved operationally inefficient. Between 1935 and 1938, Akagi underwent major reconstruction, emerging with a single, unified 249-meter flight deck and capacity for 66 aircraft. Kaga underwent analogous modification. Both vessels displaced approximately 26,000 to 38,000 tons, depending on configuration, and served as the core of Japan's carrier striking force. Britain converted 3 Courageous-class battlecruisers into carriers. HMS Courageous and HMS Glorious entered service 1928-1930, each displacing 22,500 tons, with 239-meter flight decks accommodating 48 aircraft. HMS Furious, already partially converted during World War I, received a third comprehensive reconstruction between 1922 and 1925, finally achieving a true flush deck configuration without the midship superstructure that had caused Edwin Dunning's death in 1917. These conversions provided Britain with fast, capable carriers integrated with the battle fleet. Alongside conversions, new purpose-built carriers entered service, reflecting divergent national doctrines. The United States commissioned USS Ranger, 1934, followed by USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise, 1937 to 1938, establishing a design lineage culminating in the wartime Essex class.
Japan completed Soryu, 1937, and Hiryu, 1939, medium displacement carriers emphasizing speed and aircraft capacity. Britain constructed HMS Ark Royal, 1938, and the Illustrious class, 1940-1941, featuring armored flight decks, 76mm steel plate protecting the flight deck surface, a unique design philosophy, prioritizing survivability over aircraft numbers.
These design differences reflected strategic geography and operational concepts. United States. American doctrine emphasized offensive striking power. Carriers operated with large air wings, capable of sustained long-range attacks against enemy fleets. The U.S. developed specialized carrier aircraft types, the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, optimizing for anti-shipping strikes. Training focused on coordinated mass attacks, with torpedo and dive bomber squadrons executing simultaneous strikes to overwhelm enemy defenses. Japanese doctrine integrated carriers with battleship formations, viewing them as mobile strike platforms supporting decisive fleet engagements. Japan invested heavily in pilot training, requiring 600 to 1,500 flight hours before operational deployment, far exceeding American or British standards. By 1941, Japan's first air fleet, 1st Kokukan-tai, comprised 6 fleet carriers organized into 3 two-carrier divisions, sentai, totaling over 400 aircraft crewed by exceptionally skilled aviators.
This force represented the world's most capable carrier strike group. But Japan's limited industrial base and small pilot training pipeline meant losses would prove difficult to replace.
Britain, operating primarily in the confined waters of the North Sea and Mediterranean, the Royal Navy prioritized carrier survivability against land-based air attack. Armored flight deck carriers like HMS Illustrious displaced 23,000 tons but carried only 36 aircraft versus 70 to 90 on American or Japanese equivalents, trading striking power for protection.
This philosophy later proved advantageous in the Pacific theater, when British carriers demonstrated superior resistance to kamikaze attacks in 1945, sustaining damage that would have crippled American flush-deck designs. By September 1939, carrier strength stood at United States, 7 carriers with approximately 400 embarked aircraft. Japan, 6 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers with roughly 450 aircraft. Britain, 7 carriers with approximately 250 aircraft. The battleship remained the nominal capital ship in all 3 navies, but operational doctrines had evolved to integrate carriers as essential fleet components. The coming war would test which design philosophy and operational doctrine proved most effective in actual combat, and whether carriers could challenge battleship supremacy or would remain supporting units for gun-armed surface forces. 4 engagements between November 1940 and June 1942 conclusively demonstrated that aircraft carriers had supplanted battleships as the decisive naval weapon. These actions proved carriers could strike at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers, engage enemy fleets without visual contact between surface ships, and destroy heavily armored vessels that had previously been vulnerable only to concentrated battleship gunfire.
Taranto, November 11th, 12th, 1940. 21 ferry swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian battle fleet anchored at Taranto harbor. Despite flying obsolete biplanes with maximum speeds of 90 knots, the attacking force achieved devastating results through night operations and coordinated tactics.
11 aircraft carried torpedoes fitted with specialized shallow water running mechanisms. The remaining 10 carried bombs and flares for target illumination and suppression of anti-aircraft defenses.
The raid achieved 5 torpedo hits on 3 battleships. The modern Littorio received 3 hits, while the World War I era vessels Caio do Ilio and Conte de Cavour each received 1 hit. Littorio required 4 months of repairs before returning to service.
Caio do Ilio remained under repair for 6 months. Conte de Cavour, which had settled on the harbor bottom, was raised but never returned to operational status before Italy's surrender in September 1943. In a single night, Britain had eliminated half of Italy's battleship strength, altering the Mediterranean naval balance at a cost of 2 aircraft lost to anti-aircraft fire. The Taranto attack had immediate strategic consequences.
Japanese naval observers in Rome thoroughly studied the raid's execution and results, particularly noting the use of wooden fins on British torpedoes to prevent them from plunging into the shallow harbor bottom. These observations directly influenced Japanese planning for Pearl Harbor 13 months later.
Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The first air fleet under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo comprised 6 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carrying 391 aircraft organized in 2 strike waves.
The delivery supporting forces included 2 fast battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers. The strike force achieved complete tactical surprise, with American forces at Pearl Harbor unprepared for air attack despite mounting tensions.
The results included 5 battleships sunk: Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, and Nevada, though all except Arizona and Oklahoma were later raised and returned to service. 3 battleships damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and 2,403 American casualties.
Japanese losses totaled 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 55 personnel. However, the attack failed strategically on 2 counts. First, all 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea, conducting operations and escaped destruction. Second, Pearl Harbor's repair facilities, dry docks, and fuel storage tanks containing over 300,000 tons of oil remained intact.
Admiral Nagumo declined to execute a 3rd strike wave, fearing counterattack from the unlocated American carriers. Coral Sea, May 4th to the 8th, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first naval engagement where opposing surface forces never sighted each other, with all offensive action conducted by carrier aircraft at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers.
American forces, carriers Lexington and Yorktown, with 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers, opposed a Japanese invasion force targeting Port Moresby, covered by carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Shoho, with supporting cruisers and destroyers.
Tactical results were mixed. USS Lexington was sunk, Yorktown damaged. Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk, fleet carrier Shokaku heavily damaged, and Zuikaku's air group suffered severe losses, though the ship remained undamaged. American aircraft losses totaled 83 aircraft, Japanese losses 105.
Strategically, Japan abandoned the Port Moresby invasion, marking the first check to Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Critically, damage to Shokaku and aircrew losses on Zuikaku prevented both carriers from participating in the Battle of Midway 1 month later, depriving Japan of 1/3 of its planned carrier strength at the war's turning point.
Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. American cryptanalysis had broken Japanese naval codes, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with detailed intelligence on Japanese objectives, force composition, and timing.
This enabled concentration of 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, rapidly repaired after Coral Sea damage, near Midway Atoll before Japanese forces arrived. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with 257 embarked aircraft, while American forces totaled 360 aircraft, including land-based planes on Midway.
The battle demonstrated 5 decisive factors. Intelligence. American codebreakers provided complete operational picture. Surprise. Japanese forces did not detect American carriers until 0730 on June 4. Concentration of force. American carriers coordinated strikes against dispersed Japanese units. Timing. American dive bombers arrived while Japanese carriers were rearming aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes exposed on hangar decks. And industrial capacity. America could replace losses. Japan could not.
All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, along with heavy cruiser Mikuma. Japan lost 248 aircraft and approximately 3,057 personnel, including irreplaceable veteran pilots. American losses comprised Yorktown, Hammond, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel.
From this point forward, Japan remained strategically defensive in the Pacific, unable to reconstitute the trained aircrew strength lost at Midway. These 4 battles conclusively established 3 operational principles. Carriers possessed strike ranges of 200 to 400 kilometers versus 40 kilometers for battleship main guns. Air power could sink armored capital ships faster and more reliably than surface gunfire at equivalent ranges. And carrier task forces operating with air superiority rendered battleship-centered formations obsolete. The age of gun-based fleet actions had ended. Carrier aviation now determined naval supremacy. The divergent carrier doctrines developed between 1922 and 1941 reflected fundamentally different strategic priorities, industrial capabilities, and operational theaters. By examining American, British, and Japanese approaches to carrier design and employment, the contrasting philosophies that shaped Pacific War outcomes become evident. American doctrine, offensive striking power. This philosophy manifested in large displacement hulls with extensive aviation fuel storage, ammunition magazines, and maintenance facilities. USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, displacing 36,000 tons with capacity for 78 to 90 aircraft, established American expectations for fleet carrier capabilities. The subsequent Yorktown class, 1937 to 1938, and wartime Essex class, 1943 to 1945, refined this approach. Essex class carriers displaced
27,500 tons standard, or 33,000 tons fully loaded, and operated air wings of 90 to 100 aircraft, triple the capacity of British armored carriers.
American doctrine emphasized coordinated mass strikes, combining dive bombers and torpedo bomber. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber were developed specifically for anti-shipping operations, optimized for accuracy and payload rather than air-to-air combat.
Fighter escorts, initially the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, later the F-6F Hellcat, provided protection but remained secondary to strike aircraft in air-wing composition. Critically, American industrial capacity enabled a quantity over quality approach to pilot training.
While individual American aviators in 1941 averaged 200 to 300 flight hours versus 600 to 1,500 for Japanese counterparts, the United States could rapidly expand training programs to produce thousands of replacement pilots annually.
This systematic approach to personnel development proved decisive when combat attrition eliminated experienced Japanese aircrew, losses America could absorb through its training pipeline, while Japan could not. British doctrine: armored protection. Royal Navy carrier design diverged sharply from American practice, prioritizing survivability over striking power.
Operating in the confined waters of the North Sea and Mediterranean, within range of land-based Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica aircraft, British carriers faced constant threat from shore-based air attack. The Illustrious class, commissioned 1940-1941, featured 76mm armored flight decks, armored hangar walls, and comprehensive internal subdivision.
This protection came at severe cost. HMS Illustrious displaced 23,000 tons, but carried only 36 aircraft versus 70 to 90 on American or Japanese equivalents of similar tonnage.
British carriers sacrificed offensive capability for defensive resilience, a trade-off that appeared questionable until proven during Pacific operations in 1945. When British carriers joined American forces for operations against Japan, their armored decks demonstrated superior resistance to kamikaze attacks.
American carriers struck by kamikazes suffered flight deck fires, requiring hours or days of repair. British carriers, with steel flight decks rather than wooden planking over steel, sustained comparable impacts but resumed operations within minutes. British carrier doctrine also differed in aircraft employment.
Fleet Air Arm squadrons operated multi-purpose aircraft, the Fairey Swordfish serving simultaneously as torpedo bomber, reconnaissance platform, and anti-submarine patrol aircraft. This flexibility reflected Britain's global imperial commitments, requiring carriers to perform diverse missions rather than specializing in fleet actions. Japanese doctrine: elite quality. Japanese carrier development integrated aviation with battleship-centered doctrine, viewing carriers as mobile strike platforms supporting decisive fleet engagements rather than independent capital ships.
Japanese carriers like Sokaku and Zukaku displaced 26,000 to 30,000 tons with capacity for 72 to 84 aircraft, intermediate between American offensive maximalism and British defensive conservatism.
Japanese naval aviators achieved extraordinary proficiency. Dive bombing accuracy approached 90% during the 1942 Indian Ocean raid, and torpedo attack coordination surpassed any contemporary force.
The first air fleet's 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, crewed by these elite aviators, represented the world's most capable strike force in December 1941. However, this excellence created strategic vulnerability. Japan's limited industrial base and small pilot training infrastructure meant losses proved irreplaceable.
When American dive bombers sank 4 carriers at Midway in June 1942, Japan lost not only the ships, but 248 aircraft and approximately 110 irreplaceable veteran pilots. Subsequent battles, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Philippine Sea, progressively depleted this trained cadre.
By late 1944, the Japanese carrier air groups operated with pilots averaging under 100 flight hours, incapable of executing complex strike coordination or defending against American fighter sweeps. Comparative assessment. These philosophies produced measurable outcomes.
Between 1941 and 1945, the United States commissioned 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers, 99 total aviation platforms. Japan completed 25 carriers of all types. Britain operated 7 fleet carriers in 1939, adding armored carriers during the war, but never achieving American production scale.
American industrial capacity, coupled with systematic pilot training, producing thousands of aviators annually, enabled sustained offensive operations that overwhelmed both Japanese quality-focused and British survivability-focused approaches.
The carrier war became a contest of industrial attrition, and America's ability to replace losses faster than opponents could inflict them proved decisive. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, and August 1945, when Japan capitulated, the carrier had conclusively displaced the battleship as naval warfare's dominant platform.
This transformation manifested in fleet composition, tactical doctrine, strategic reach, and industrial priorities. Fleet composition shift. In September 1939, the United States Navy operated 7 aircraft carriers. By August 1945, American carrier strength had expanded to 28 Essex-class and Independence-class fleet carriers, plus 71 escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls. 99 carriers total, displacing over 2 million tons aggregate. During this same period, battleship construction largely ceased. Only 4 Iowa-class battleships were completed, with Montana-class vessels canceled in favor of additional Essex-class carriers. Japan began the Pacific War with 8 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers. Despite constructing 15 additional carriers during the conflict, cumulative losses, 24 carriers sunk by war's end, left Japan with a single operational carrier, Hosho, in August 1945.
Britain operated 7 carriers in 1939, adding armored fleet carriers and escort carriers during the war to reach approximately 50 carriers of all types by 1945.
This delivery disparity reflected industrial capacity. American shipyards delivered one Essex-class carrier every 2 months during peak production in 1943-1944, while Japan required 18 to 24 months to complete equivalent vessels.
The United States simultaneously mass-produced carrier aircraft, over 300,000 naval aircraft between 1940 and 1945, overwhelming Japanese production of approximately 60,000 aircraft across all military branches. Tactical doctrine evolution. Carrier operations redefined naval engagement ranges and coordination requirements.
Pre-war battleship actions occurred at 15 to 25 kilometer ranges, determined by optical fire control and maximum gun elevation. Carrier strikes operated at 200 to 400 kilometer ranges, extending beyond visual contact between surface forces.
The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first naval engagement where opposing fleets never sighted each other's ships. All offensive action conducted by carrier aircraft. This extended range necessitated new command structures.
American carrier task forces developed concentric defense zones. Combat air patrols, or CAP, engaged approaching enemy aircraft 50 to 100 kilometers from the fleet. Radar-directed fighter interception extended this zone to 150 kilometers. Anti-aircraft cruisers and destroyers provided terminal defense within 10 kilometers.
Coordination required integration of radar detection, radio communication, and fighter direction, transforming naval warfare from direct fire exchanges to complex information processing operations. Strike coordination similarly evolved.
By 1944, American carrier task groups executed coordinated attacks with 100-plus aircraft from multiple carriers, synchronized to arrive simultaneously and overwhelm defenses. Japanese forces, depleted of experienced pilots, proved incapable of comparable coordination.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, termed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated this disparity. American carriers launched 450 sorties that destroyed 645 Japanese aircraft, including land-based planes, while losing 123 American aircraft, primarily to operational accidents rather than combat.
Strategic reach and power projection. Carriers enabled sustained operations thousands of kilometers from land bases. American fast carrier task forces operated continuously in the Western Pacific from mid-1944 through August 1945, supported by mobile logistics groups, providing underway refueling, ammunition transfer, and provisions.
This delivery train, tankers, ammunition ships, supply vessels, sustained operations without returning to rear area bases, effectively creating mobile forward positions. The strategic implications were profound.
Traditional battleship fleets required secure anchorages for replenishment, limiting operational radius to distances that could be covered between friendly ports.
Carrier task forces with underway replenishment ranged indefinitely, constrained only by machinery endurance and crew fatigue. By July 1945, American carriers operated within striking range of the Japanese home islands, launching attacks against Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kure, demonstrating complete air-sea dominance without requiring amphibious invasion.
Post-war architecture. Victory validated carrier-centered fleet design. The United States Navy's post-war construction focused on supercarriers. USS Midway, commissioned September 1945, displaced 45,000 tons with capacity for 137 aircraft, 50% larger than wartime Essex-class vessels.
Subsequent designs: Forrestal-class 1955, Kitty Hawk-class 1961, Enterprise nuclear 1961, and Nimitz-class 1975, progressively increased displacement to over 100,000 tons, operating 80 to 90 modern jet aircraft with strike ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers.
Britain and Japan, economically exhausted by war, could not sustain carrier development at American scale. Britain operated modernized wartime carriers into the 1970s before retiring fixed-wing carrier aviation. Japan, prohibited from operating offensive weapons under its post-war constitution, built helicopter-carrying destroyers rather than fleet carriers.
The Soviet Union, lacking carrier experience and prioritizing submarines and land-based aviation, did not commission its first carrier until 1975. This concentration of carrier power established American naval supremacy for the remainder of the 20th century, a dominance rooted directly in lessons learned during the Pacific War's carrier battles.
The delivery aircraft carrier revolution between 1908 and 1945 demonstrated three enduring principles of military technological transformation. Conceptual vision precedes practical implementation. Doctrinal flexibility determines operational success, and industrial capacity converts tactical advantages into strategic dominance. Conceptual vision. Clement Adar's 1909 conceptualization of the carrier, continuous flight deck, hangar facilities, aircraft elevators, specialized systems, anticipated the final design configuration by over a decade. Similarly, American, British, and Japanese experiments between 1910 and 1918 established foundational operational principles before purpose-built carriers entered service. This pattern, theoretical projection, followed by iterative practical development, characterizes successful military innovation. Technologies that lack conceptual frameworks, regardless of technical sophistication, rarely achieve operational relevance. American forces, initially inferior in equipment and training, adapted doctrine to leverage industrial advantages. Mass pilot training replaced elite selection. Coordinated multi-carrier strikes substituted for individual ship excellence. Attrition warfare exploited replacement capacity.
Britain's armored carrier doctrine, initially questioned as sacrificing offensive power, proved invaluable against kamikaze attacks, demonstrating that doctrinal diversity provides strategic resilience. The critical lesson: tactical superiority at war's outset matters less than institutional capacity to learn, adapt, and scale successful practices.
Japan's inability to replace lost expertise doomed its carrier force regardless of initial advantages. Industrial capacity. American production of 99 carriers and 300,000-plus naval aircraft versus Japanese production of 25 carriers and 60,000 total aircraft illustrated the decisive role of industrial base in sustained conflict. Technological sophistication and tactical excellence cannot compensate for order-of-magnitude production disparities over multi-year campaigns. The Pacific War became an industrial contest, and America's manufacturing capacity, mobilized for carrier and aircraft production, rendered tactical setbacks temporary, while strategic victory became inevitable.
The paradigm shift. The carrier's displacement of the battleship represented more than platform replacement. It embodied a fundamental reconceptualization of naval power. Battleships projected power through direct fire at visual ranges, requiring physical presence at the point of engagement. Carriers projected power through aircraft at extended ranges, separating the platform from the strike zone. This decoupling of platform location from strike effect presaged modern precision strike warfare, where weapons launched hundreds or thousands of kilometers from targets render platform survivability largely independent of target proximity.
The aircraft carrier did not merely supplement existing naval forces, it redefined what constituted naval power. From 1945 forward, control of oceanic spaces derived not from gun-armed surface vessels, but from air superiority extended over maritime domains.
This conceptual framework persists in contemporary naval strategy, where carrier strike groups remain the primary instrument of American sea control and power projection. The lessons of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea, that dominance in the air determines supremacy on the sea, continue to shape naval doctrine 8 decades later, confirming the carrier revolution as one of warfare's most consequential technological transformations.